You won't believe what happened when an HOA Karen decided she had the power to bulldoze a homeowner's house without his permission. But what she didn't know, the owner was a federal agent, and he was about to make her pay. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you amazing stories like this one. The Briarwood Lakes community had always been a peaceful, upper-middle-class neighborhood, a place where families could feel safe, lawns were perfectly trimmed, and homes all followed a uniform aesthetic. The Homeowners Association, or HOA, was supposed to keep things organized and maintain the neighborhood's pristine reputation. But under the rule of Margaret Karen Holloway, the HOA had become less of a governing body and more of a tyrannical regime. Margaret, a woman in her late 50s with an iron grip on the neighborhood, saw herself as the ultimate authority, the self-appointed queen of Briarwood Lakes. She had held the position of HOA president for nearly a decade, unchallenged, because no one had dared to stand up to her. Margaret's power came from her ability to control nearly every aspect of her neighbors' lives. She enforced rules that weren't even in the HOA handbook, fining homeowners for things as trivial as using the wrong shade of beige for their shutters or leaving their trash cans at the curb for more than 20 minutes after collection. She issued penalties for mailboxes that didn't conform to her personal vision of neighborhood harmony, and even dictated what types of flowers could be planted in front yards. Homeowners who tried to reason with her were met with condescending smiles, passive-aggressive threats, and if they pushed too hard, outright harassment. Over the years, she had driven out multiple families who had refused to comply with her ridiculous demands. Most people in Briarwood Lakes learned to either comply or keep their heads down. But everything changed when David Reynolds moved into the neighborhood. David was not an ordinary homeowner. In his late 40s, tall and exuding quiet authority, he had spent decades in government service. What most people didn't know, including Margaret, was that David was a high-ranking federal agent specializing in financial crimes and corruption. His work had taken him all over the country, dismantling white-collar crime rings and taking down powerful criminals. After years of working in high-pressure environments, he had decided to settle down in a quiet neighborhood where he could enjoy some peace. Briarwood Lakes had seemed perfect until he encountered Margaret. It started almost immediately. Within a week of moving in, David found a notice taped to his door. It was an official letter from the HOA stating that his driveway was not in compliance with neighborhood standards. Confused, he inspected his driveway. It was freshly paved, identical to his neighbor's, and in perfect condition. Assuming it was a mistake, he set the letter aside. But then more letters followed. One accused him of having an unauthorized front door, even though it was the exact same model as the one on the house next door. Another cited his landscaping as a violation, despite the fact that he hadn't even touched the yard since moving in. The most ridiculous complaint was about his security cameras. Margaret claimed they were a privacy violation and ordered him to remove them immediately. David wasn't the type to be easily intimidated. Instead of reacting emotionally, he did what he did best. He started gathering evidence. He meticulously documented every letter, recorded every conversation, and even installed additional cameras to capture Margaret's frequent inspections of his property. The more he observed, the clearer it became that Margaret was running the HOA like her own personal fiefdom. Curious about how deep this went, David began researching past HOA activities. He found troubling signs of financial irregularities, misused funds, payments made to contractors who never seemed to complete any work, and large sums of money that had simply vanished from HOA accounts. Margaret, it seemed, wasn't just power-hungry. She was potentially corrupt. Determined to confront her, David attended the next HOA meeting. The conference room was packed with homeowners, many of whom looked weary and resigned. Margaret sat at the head of the table, flanked by her loyal board members, who acted more like her personal enforcers than elected representatives. When David calmly questioned the legitimacy of his fines, Margaret gave him her trademark, condescending smile. "Mr. Reynolds, the HOA has rules, and everyone is expected to follow them," she said, her tone dripping with false politeness. "I understand that," David replied evenly, "but I've reviewed the HOA agreement, and none of the things I'm being fined for are actually violations." Margaret's smile faltered for just a moment before she regained her composure. Well, some rules are unwritten but still necessary for maintaining the community's standards. David raised an eyebrow. Unwritten rules? That doesn't sound legally enforceable. Margaret waved a hand dismissively. If you don't like it, perhaps this isn't the right neighborhood for you. The arrogance in her tone was almost laughable. David had spent years dealing with people who thought they were untouchable, and he recognized the signs immediately. Margaret had been in power too long, and she believed she was invincible. After the meeting, several homeowners approached David in hushed voices, telling him their own horror stories. One man, an elderly veteran, had been fined repeatedly for parking his legally registered truck in his own driveway. A young couple had been forced to repaint their house 3 times because Margaret kept changing the approved color palette. Another woman, a single mother, had been threatened with foreclosure over a minor dispute about her garden fence. The more David learned, the angrier he became. Margaret had been bullying homeowners for years, and no one had been able to stop her. But she had finally picked the wrong target. That night, David took his investigation further. Using his federal access, he started digging into Margaret's financial history. What he found was shocking. Not only was she mismanaging HOA funds, but she had funneled thousands of dollars into a personal account under the guise of community improvement projects. There were fraudulent invoices, ghost contractors, and even evidence that she had manipulated HOA elections to keep herself in power. This was no longer just about petty fines and power trips. Margaret was committing real crimes. David could have gone straight to law enforcement, but he knew that wouldn't be enough. He wanted to dismantle Margaret's entire operation and make sure she could never victimize anyone again. So he planned carefully, gathering every piece of evidence he needed. Meanwhile, Margaret, still unaware of the storm heading her way, escalated her attacks. One morning, David woke up to find a new notice taped to his door. This time, it was an official warning that if he did not comply with all HOA mandates within 30 days, the association would take further corrective action. David smirked as he read the letter. Margaret thought she was in control. She had no idea what was coming next. David had dealt with criminals, fraudsters, and corrupt officials in his career, but even he was shocked by the audacity of what Margaret did next. For weeks, she had been increasing the pressure, issuing daily fines and bogus warnings, but none of it seemed to break him. Instead, he fought back, filing complaints with state oversight boards and quietly compiling evidence of her corruption. But Margaret wasn't just desperate. She was reckless. One morning, David received a final notice from the HOA. The letter, written in bold, aggressive language, stated that due to his failure to comply with HOA regulations, the association had decided to take action. It cited a completely fabricated abandonment clause, claiming that because his house was not properly maintained, the blatant lie, the HOA had the right to reclaim the property. The notice concluded with a chilling statement. Further corrective measures will be taken within 48 hours. David immediately knew something was wrong. HOA regulations, no matter how strict, did not grant them the power to seize someone's property, especially not for nonsense violations. But Margaret clearly believed she could get away with it. He spent the next day consulting with lawyers, drafting emergency legal filings, and preparing to confront the HOA in court. But Margaret wasn't going to wait. The following afternoon, David was at work when his phone buzzed with an urgent call. It was one of his neighbors, a woman named Linda, who had been secretly feeding him information about Margaret's abuses. Her voice was panicked. "David, you need to get home. Right now." David didn't even wait for an explanation. He grabbed his keys and rushed out of the office, his heart pounding. Something was very, very wrong. When he pulled onto a street, what he saw made his blood run cold. A bulldozer was sitting in what used to be his driveway. His house, the home he had legally purchased and lived in, was reduced to rubble. A demolition crew was still on site, clearing debris, as if they had just finished tearing it down. And standing at the edge of the destruction, looking smugly satisfied, was Margaret Holloway. David stepped out of his car, his fists clenched. He had seen a lot in his career, but this was beyond anything he had ever encountered. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. Margaret turned, feigning innocence. "Oh, David, I see you got my letter. Your property was in violation of multiple HOA codes, and since you refused to bring it up to standard, we had to take action. Don't worry, the lot will be put to good use. We're considering a new community center in this space." David could barely process the sheer audacity of her words. She had bulldozed his house, without notice, without legal authority, and was now acting like she had done him a favor. The demolition crew, realizing something was off, hesitated as they watched the confrontation. "This is illegal," David said, his voice dangerously low. "You had no right, no authority to do this." Margaret scoffed. "Actually, I do. The HOA has broad enforcement powers, and your noncompliance gave us full jurisdiction. If you have a problem, take it up with the board." She gestured toward a few of her loyal HOA members, who were standing nearby, watching nervously. Even they looked unsure about what had just happened. David took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He knew losing his temper wouldn't help. But he also knew one thing for sure. Margaret had just made the biggest mistake of her life. He pulled out his phone and started recording. "I want you to say that again, on record," he said. "You're admitting that you ordered the demolition of my house without a court order, without government approval, and without any legal authority." Margaret's smug expression faltered for a second. "David, there's no need for that." "No, say it again," David pressed. "Say on record that you ordered this." Margaret's eyes darted around, suddenly aware that she might have overplayed her hand. "I don't need to explain myself to you," she snapped. "If you have a complaint, file it with the HOA." David smirked. "Oh, I'm going to do a lot more than that." By now, neighbors had started gathering, watching the confrontation unfold. Some of them had been victims of Margaret's harassment for years, and the sight of her finally being challenged filled them with hope. Others were simply stunned. No one had ever imagined that the HOA would go so far as to demolish someone's home. Then, David noticed something else: his security cameras. Or rather, what was left of them. The cameras he had installed around his property had been smashed to pieces, but the storage unit that recorded the footage was in a fireproof, tamper-resistant casing. If it had survived the demolition, it would have captured everything. "Where's my security system?" David asked. Margaret's face twitched. "I have no idea what you're talking about." David didn't believe that for a second. He turned to the demolition crew. "Who ordered this job?" The lead contractor, a burly man in a hard hat, looked uncomfortable. "We were hired by the HOA," he admitted. "We were told it was an abandoned property, and the demolition was authorized." "Do you have that in writing?" David asked. The contractor hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, we have a work order." He walked over to his truck and pulled out a document. David took one look at it and felt a surge of triumph. It was signed by Margaret herself. She must have realized the trap she had walked into because she suddenly turned defensive. "You need to leave, David. This is HOA business, and you're no longer a homeowner in this community." David laughed, a dark, humorless sound. "Oh, Margaret, you have no idea what you've just done." Margaret's expression shifted from arrogance to uncertainty. For the first time, she seemed to realize that this wasn't going to go the way she had planned. David turned to the crowd of neighbors. "All of you, if you have any complaints against the HOA, if you've been fined, threatened, or harassed by this woman, I need you to come forward. Because I promise you, this isn't over." The crowd murmured in agreement. Some of them nodded, while others pulled out their phones, ready to share their own stories. Margaret took a step back, suddenly looking nervous. "You can't fight the HOA, David." David met her gaze, his eyes cold. "Watch me." Margaret Holloway had spent years ruling the Briarwood Lakes community with an iron fist, believing herself to be untouchable. She had bullied homeowners, embezzled HOA funds, and now she had committed what could only be described as outright destruction of private property. But what she didn't realize was that she had just bulldozed the wrong house. David Reynolds wasn't just some ordinary homeowner. He was a federal agent, an expert in investigating financial crimes, and most importantly, a man who did not take injustice lightly. As Margaret stood in front of the ruins of David's home, smug and self-satisfied, she had no idea that her reign of terror was about to come crashing down. The very first thing David did was secure his security camera footage. As he suspected, the fireproof storage unit that housed his recordings had survived the demolition. He retrieved it from the wreckage, took it to his car, and played back the last 48 hours. The footage was damning. It showed Margaret standing with the demolition crew, personally overseeing the destruction of his home. It recorded her giving orders, smiling as the walls came down, and even mocking David's property as an eyesore that needed to be cleansed from the neighborhood. David uploaded everything to the cloud and made several copies. This was going to be the key to taking Margaret down. But he wasn't stopping at just exposing her. No, he was going to destroy her legally, financially, and publicly. David drove straight to his lawyer's office. After explaining the situation, his attorney's jaw nearly hit the floor. "They bulldoze your house," the lawyer repeated, incredulous. "Yes, without a court order, without government approval. Nothing," David confirmed. "I need a full-scale lawsuit. Property destruction, trespassing, damages, you name it." The lawyer nodded, already drafting documents. "We're going after them for everything. Not just Margaret, but the entire HOA. And we're going to make sure this goes public." Within 24 hours, David had filed a massive civil lawsuit against the HOA and Margaret personally. It wasn't just about the cost of his house. He was suing for punitive damages, emotional distress, and criminal misconduct. Next, David contacted his own federal connections. As a senior financial crimes investigator, he had access to people who could dig deeper than Margaret could ever imagine. He forwarded all the financial documents he had gathered over the past few months, exposing how Margaret had embezzled HOA funds, laundered money through fake contractors, and used HOA accounts for personal expenses. It wasn't long before federal investigators, his colleagues, opened a full-scale probe. But that wasn't all. Destroying someone's private property without legal authority wasn't just a civil matter. It was a criminal act. He filed a police report, and given the evidence he provided, local law enforcement had no choice but to escalate the case. The next morning, police officers showed up at Margaret's house with a warrant for her arrest. Margaret still didn't fully grasp the storm heading her way. Even as the lawsuit was filed and law enforcement got involved, she still believed she could intimidate her way out of it. But then came the final blow: public exposure. David contacted local news stations and handed them everything: the footage, the fraudulent HOA documents, the proof of corruption. Within hours, the story was on the news. Homeowners Association demolishes house without permission. Federal agent strikes back. It was all over the internet. Social media exploded with outrage. People across the country hated HOAs, and Margaret had just become the ultimate symbol of their worst abuses. Neighbors, many of whom had suffered under Margaret's rule for years, started coming forward. Homeowners who had been fined unfairly, people whose homes had been threatened, residents who had been forced to pay bogus fees. All of them shared their stories. Under mounting pressure, the HOA board panicked. They scrambled to distance themselves from Margaret, claiming they had no idea she was operating outside legal boundaries. But it was too late. The entire HOA was now under federal investigation. 3 weeks later, Margaret sat in a courtroom, her usual smug arrogance replaced with visible fear. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The financial crimes alone were enough to ensure she would never hold a position of power again. But the illegal demolition? That was what sealed her fate. The judge did not hold back. "Ms. Holloway, your actions were not only unethical, but criminal. You abused your position, stole from your own community, and carried out an illegal demolition of a resident's home. This court finds you guilty of fraud, destruction of private property, and financial misconduct." Margaret was sentenced to 7 years in prison. The HOA, completely dismantled. A state-appointed oversight committee took over, rewriting policies and refunding thousands of dollars in fraudulent fines to homeowners. Several board members resigned in disgrace, and new elections were held to ensure that nothing like this ever happened again. And David? He didn't just win his lawsuit. He owned the HOA by the time it was over. The court ruled in his favor, awarding him a massive settlement. The HOA had to pay him triple the cost of his home, cover all legal fees, and issue a public apology. But David had no interest in staying. With his settlement money, he bought a new home, far away from any HOA. As he packed his things to leave Briarwood Lakes for good, his neighbors gathered to say their goodbyes. One of them, an elderly man who had been tormented by Margaret's petty fines for years, shook his hand. "Thank you for standing up to her," the man said. "We never thought anyone could." David smiled. Some people think they're untouchable until they mess with the wrong person. As he drove away, leaving Briarwood Lakes and its dark past behind, he felt a sense of justice. Margaret had tried to ruin him. Instead, she had destroyed herself.